A quick announcement before we start the show. The Business of Politics podcast is celebrating its first birthday, and you get the gift. When you leave a review on Apple Podcasts for the show and let me know, send me an email, DM on Twitter, or message on LinkedIn, I'll send you one of our official show mugs. They're really cool. I give it one to every guest. Now on to the show.
I learned more from my experience of running for office than I did majoring in political science.
I'm Eric Wilson, managing partner of Startup Caucus, the home of campaign tech innovation on the right. Welcome to the Business of Politics show. On this podcast, you're joining in on a conversation with entrepreneurs, operatives, candidates, and experts who make professional politics happen. Today, we're talking with Matthew Foldi, conservative journalist and former congressional candidate for Maryland's 6th Congressional District. We dig into his experience as a candidate and gain insights about how he scaled his startup campaign. So, Matthew, I want to start with what motivated you to make the leap from being an operative, you've held different campaign roles at different organizations, to actually putting your name on the ballot and running?
Well, hello, Eric, and thanks so much for having me on. I'm excited to talk with you today and probably even more excited to get a mug. And I definitely urge all of your listeners to take the 3 seconds to leave a review. Otherwise, they're going to have to come on the show in order to get a mug. So that seems like...
And we only ask tough questions.
Yes. I mean, this seems like they get the better deal than I do in terms of mug getting. But you're right. I had worked on a lot of different campaigns and committees, and I threw my hat in the ring this cycle. And really what was one of the most startup campaigns imaginable. But it wasn't that crazy for me. When I was in college at the University of Chicago, I actually became the youngest elected official still in Chicago history when I was 19, when the Chicago GOP begged me to run for ward committee man there. And I didn't really have any interest because I was more about electing other people than myself. But after a lot of imploring, I decided to do it. And we was a whole circus. We took my fake Democratic plant opponent to court, told her that you can, be convicted of rampant ballot fraud or you can drop out. So I pulled an Obama, disqualified her, and then was able to win that unopposed. But so I had done it in the past.
Chicago style.
I learned more from my experience of running for office than I did majoring in political science. But, this year, to no one's surprise, obviously will be a huge year for Republicans. And, it drives me crazy as a native Maryland guy, the afterthought that our state is both in national politics and even within the state of Maryland. And where I live in Montgomery County, we're more perceived as a piggy bank for Republicans and Democratic candidates than, being an area that actually should have a Republican congressman, because following the work that Governor Larry Hogan did in getting us fairer maps in Maryland, northern Montgomery County going all the way to the end of western Maryland now is one of the toss-up districts in the country. And so I was covering redistricting when I was a reporter at the Washington Free Beacon. It was incredibly clear to me that based on the case that Hogan and his team were arguing, that we would get a different map. Originally, Democrats had gerrymandered Maryland this cycle to be an 8-0 Dem state, even though we have one of the most popular two-term Republican governors in the country. So I was looking at all of this, objectively as a former House Super PAC guy. And I said, wow, so we have a huge opportunity here. And I filed on the last day to run in the 6th district, which gave me very little time to scale up a campaign. I'm sure we'll talk about the startup aspects of that. And then within just 100 very short days, I went from nothing to second place, which was cool. Obviously, I was running to win, but came up short and learned a lot along the way.
Well, you highlight something that I talk with founders about all the time, which is politics and political campaigns are some of the best examples of startups, because you go from zero to, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you're the nominee, millions of dollars, and
Well,
you
I raised
spend it
hundreds
to
of
zero.
thousands of dollars without even being the nominee.
Correct. Right. So you got to do that obviously before you get to the stage, is my point, and raise lots of money very quickly, which is we'll talk a little bit more about kind of as a skill, but it is a startup culture as much as anything else, and I think it's an even more intense crucible for startup skills, because your election day is set in stone. If there are lots of startups that kind of amble along for years, and this really is a forcing function.
Well, we actually this year, and maybe this happens elsewhere, from time to time, every 10 years, with the decennial redistricting cycle, our election days were not set in stone. They actually
Right.
delayed the primary by 3 weeks, which, as I was thinking about whether I wanted to do this, kept sort of throwing wrenches in my plans of, do I want to go through with this? So we went from our standard June primary that we usually have to an unprecedented midsummer July primary in Maryland. But yes, normally you do have your set primaries and general election days.
So Matthew, what surprised you the most about running for office in the primary?
It's just different when you're doing it yourself as opposed to doing it, for other people. But one of my favorite anecdotes on the trail that sort of gets to that was I was in Garrett County, which is the westernmost county in Maryland, for their Lincoln Day dinner. And a couple of weeks earlier, I had done a Fox and Friends hit where they just, as they do on TV, cycled through some pictures from the campaign trail. But some of them were from the Garrett County Republican Party's headquarters office opening.
Mm-hmm.
And my friends in Garrett County printed those pictures and then gave them to the people who were in those pictures. And then they asked me to sign them. I was like, why do you even want me to sign anything? It's ridiculous. But, that was cool, because Garrett County is one of those areas of the country that does not get the attention that it needs, both, in terms of positive press. There's so much to do there. And also in terms of attention from Congress. It's an incredibly Republican county, one of the most Republican in the country. And, outside of Larry Hogan, there are no Republicans who there are no Republicans who represent that area. So it's not like, Chris Van Hollen, Ben Cardin, David Trone can even find that area on a map. So being able to represent these areas and get them the attention that they deserve, even just from a primary campaign, was, incredibly rewarding.
So is it, when you say it's different, is it the fact that it is your name on the ballot and you, like, the buck stops with you?
In essence, yeah.
I think that a lot of people don't appreciate how much of an impact this has on candidates and decision making. Someone asked me the other night could you come up with an algorithm that basically helps someone run the perfect campaign? And I say, well, sure, that's the easy part. Finding a candidate who will listen to it is the hard part, right? Because whenever it is your name on the ballot and your reputation at risk, your relationships, that becomes a lot more difficult.
Yeah, and it's just sort of an indescribable way in which it's different. But, when I am chatting with either other former candidates or our nominees or members of Congress, it's just you sort of get it. You can talk about these things that happened on the trail that basically happened to everyone, and you just sort of are in this club of people who went through the ringer because we want to make our country better. And, I think we all want that, but this is such a unique way of trying to make that happen that until you've done it yourself, it's just hard to imagine. Like, I've knocked on, for example, thousands of doors for other Republican candidates across the country, but doing it for myself was just, it felt a little weird.
Weird how?
See, that's the thing. I don't even know exactly how, because it's the exact same thing. It's basically the same script that you would do for anyone else. It's the same script that I've done since the primary for other Republicans in Maryland. I guess maybe I would say it felt surreal the whole
Mm.
time of doing this when I was 25 and, getting second place in every single county in the district. And obviously, overall having the faith and trust put in me as opposed to, someone else from these people to be their voice in government. It's just different when you know that you're advocating for yourself as opposed to advocating for your friends who are running or for other, candidates who you believe in.
And so, Matthew, on the other side of that coin, what don't political operatives understand about campaigning?
There are obviously the political operatives and staff who are doing the day to day, and then those who are doing the bigger picture. Um, I think that, we can, when we're reading about campaigns or things like that, we forget that it is actually just someone like you and me who's doing all of the things. And, it gives the whole experience gave me a huge amount of respect for anyone, Republican or Democratic, who says, you know what, I want to do this myself. And I think that, my team all understood like this, what you're doing is you're doing this. And we're just helping, we're along for the ride to help make it happen. But sometimes I think, it's easy to forget that it's an incredibly stressful thing. And, the person who is the candidate is as much a person as the staff. And I think there's a lot of frustration from staff from time to time about candidates not listening. I would say to, basically every candidate, just listen. As long as you are in a good place with your staff and think you can trust them, just understand that they're not going to make your life more difficult. I took the keys, gave them to the team and said, do whatever you want. Tell me where you need to be, which surprised them how lax I was with this because everyone had basically worked with hard to manage candidates
Right.
at times. But, you don't want to be wasting your own team's time. That's one of the axiomatic truths that everyone's always told is, you can't get time back in a campaign. And when you're doing a 100-day primary, you really can't get time. So we definitely did not waste really any time. But the takeaway we had was basically it was still just too short a time to get my name ID up to where it needed to be. But the reception for the campaign that we ran was phenomenal. We just didn't get enough people.
Right.
We didn't get on enough people's radars.
Well, you raise a really important point here, which is I see it almost universally that every candidate spends a lot of time and energy making sure that they pick the smartest, best people to run their campaign. And then for the rest of the campaign, they don't listen to them. And I get it. It's tough when you're getting contradicting advice, maybe from your own advisors at the table, from the people that you've had relationships with before. But I think your advice is apt of you hired these professionals for a reason. Listen to them. It's not, sort of abdicating your responsibility. But at the same time, I think I want to give probably the most important piece of advice I can give to anyone who's trying to build a career in politics is go work on a campaign. Go and do what you did and have done and knock on doors, be outside of Washington, D.C., where actual Republican voters live, and get to know the process, get to understand how people make their decisions. It's just, it's really the biggest advantage you could have if you're trying to build a career in DC.
Yeah, everything along the way that I've done, I can't imagine doing it or having done any of it without being, when I was in high school, I was Maryland Young Republican of the Year, Montgomery County Young Republican of the Year, and all of that just stemming from, tens of thousands of houses knocked on and phones called. It's you got to do it, and every single person on my team door knocked with me, and
Right.
it's a good. And, my GC, amazing guy, he said, it's important for all of us to make sure that we're in touch with the people who we're trying to get to elect you to Congress.
Well, that drives directly to another piece of startup advice, which is to get to know your user, right? You can't solve their problems if you don't know who they are and what they need.
Correct.
Matthew, what advice would you give to someone who's listening to this podcast and is thinking about running as a candidate themselves? What are some considerations they should have before they go down that path?
Make sure you've done your homework. For example, in Maryland, it's incredibly easy to get on the ballot. I drove to Annapolis, paid $100, and became a candidate on the last day. But you want to make sure that before you do it, you have as many ducks in a row lined up as possible, but also understand that you're not going to have everything that you need right off the bat. You're not going to have a perfect website. You're not going to have every possible box checked off. And I think as long as you've done the major things that you need to do, like making sure that you're not going to get kicked off the ballot for bad signatures or, things like that. And as long as you have a sense of where you need to go, there's a basic checklist that anyone should have, but understand that you're just going to have to roll with some punches and then hopefully minimize all further amounts of punches after that. But definitely, I think for us, the most hectic part was probably the first couple of days of just, wow, we're doing this. Let's go win.
Right. It's like the old adage, everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face.
Yeah.
And you get punched in the face a lot in campaigns. One thing that jumps out to me, and I see this a lot in my international work, is it's very common for campaign staff and operatives to run as candidates themselves, right? We've sort of moved away from that in the US in response to kind of like the Tea Party movement of where we want the joke is conservative outsiders, right? Where we want people who have had no experience. And then the other thing that I point out is it is common practice and just about everywhere else in the world to have a full ballot for your party in every contest, whether you have a shot of winning or not. And in Virginia, where I live, there were state House of Delegates races a couple of years ago where it was just uncontested. We see that in other states, and that has the effect of, of course, it's unlikely that Republicans would win those seats, but it also frees up resources and focus. So I think what you've done is a good model for other people going forward. Of let's press the issue in every seat in every district.
Yeah, I mean, and that's smart. The race I was in was not a sacrificial lamb kind of district, right. But what I said. One of the reasons why I filed was when I was working as a reporter at the Free Beacon. I did lots of stories on Democratic corruption, the disastrous Biden administration. But I have thoughts not for this podcast on the media. But one of the ways, that I always say you see media biases both in what they cover and what they choose not to cover.
Exactly.
And to me, one of the most glaring examples of that was, the government, the Capitol that we pay for, was closed by Pelosi and Schumer. People didn't even realize this. We have a Capitol Hill press corps that, when they're not working from home all day, is there to walk around and harass Republicans. But Democrats had literally just not been going to work. They'd been proxy voting or not
from France
for years. And so as I was walking around our government, realizing that we have a governing political party that has no interest in working, I was, frustrated as a taxpayer and citizen. And then, of course, I saw that the congressman here, David Trone, had not been working. All of his district offices have been closed for 2 years. He's running Total Wine, which has 0 locations in our district, 7 days a week. But if you want to try and reach this guy, it's impossible. And I saw that we were not pressing him on this. So I said, look, I'm going to go do this myself. Hold him accountable for a 2-year taxpayer funded vacation and not working. And I'm going to make him spend here. And because Trone is a multimillionaire Democratic mega donor, it's the only reason he's in Congress. And he just donates to Democrats around the country. I said, this is insane. We've got an actual R+1 district that he's running in. I'm going to make him, dedicate resources here. The only jobs he creates in this district are when he drops, tens of millions for his reelect every 2 years. Otherwise, he does literally nothing here, doesn't show up, doesn't do anything. And I did exactly what I set out to do, which was he donated 10 million of his own money to his campaign. DCCC listed him as a vulnerable incumbent and put the race on the map. I mean, this is a district and this is a congressman no one had ever heard of because he literally doesn't work. So that was, it's important, obviously, to contest elections because, American people should have a choice in who they're voting for. There were people in this district, in the Montgomery County side who are running super uphill battles, but we're better off for being able to vote for them and, having them go into very Dem areas and saying to voters, you don't have to suffer unified one party rule in Annapolis. And that's definitely important because, Democratic rule is terrible. In Montgomery County, our county executive is a disaster. And obviously, Dems in Annapolis are poised to have unified control for the first time in a while. And Maryland will absolutely be suffering because of that.
You're listening to the Business of Politics show. I'm speaking with Matthew Foldi about his recent congressional campaign in Maryland. Now, you're obviously very savvy with social media and internet culture. How are you able to take advantage of that in your campaign?
One of the ways that I did that was going to David Trone's offices and just filming very short videos outside of them and pointing out that he doesn't work because he would just get this free pass from journalists. His team would say, our offices are open. Journalists
Right.
would say, okay, and then do no follow-up because their definition of open meant that someone was sitting on a computer. And even though they basically, I don't even think had call forwarding set up because when I was doing my reporting as a journalist about Democrats who don't work, I couldn't even reach his offices. So, but journalists will take any talking point from a Democrat at face value and do absolutely no further digging. I mean, remember that literally the Capitol Hill press corps walked by Chuck Schumer's closed office for 2 years and never reported that he doesn't work. So, they have interests in protecting their Dem sources and don't want to tell the American people that an entire political party doesn't work. So that was one way. That was probably a main way of doing that. But the real success of our campaign was the traditional voter contacts that we did. We did almost 500,000 in about 100 days. And
Wow.
I think that journalists, again, are incredibly lazy and will take any narrative given to them by Democrats. So they wrongly believe that our campaign was some online-only campaign, even though we
Right.
did over 300,000 calls, things like that. And I always think it's funny now that I'm back to looking at politics more nationally. John Fetterman in Pennsylvania is barely alive, right? And his campaign is actually online only. It's just they hired a bunch of 5-year-olds to tweet for them and use TikTok for him, which is obviously controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. And that is an online only campaign. John Fetterman is not physically well enough to campaign. And he actually gets glowing coverage for his online only campaign. And voters are gaslit into thinking that he is well and to think that he is running an actual campaign. So that's an interesting sort of contrast to me is, journalists will rave about when Democrats use a lot of the technologies that you talk about here and then minimize when Republicans do it. And you should, and your listeners should ask, why is that? Well, it's because a lot of them are effective and it's bad for journalists if more Republicans are elected. And, if we use innovative technology, that could be beneficial to us. So, therefore it is bad.
So you used let me just clarify. So are you saying that you used your social media savvy and ability to create this culture and your existing network as kind of a top of funnel for recruiting people into the volunteer and that voter contact?
That was one of the ways to do it. I think the two main things that were helpful to me in terms of getting people to volunteer on my campaign as opposed to any other campaign they possibly could were people from around the country who were phone banking for me, who knew me from my reporting or followed me on Twitter and then reached out and said that they want to help. So that was one way, and then the other was the people that I know from almost half my life in Maryland politics and working in the area. So we had a hugely robust in-person volunteer network in addition to, and after my primary, I've repurposed my phone bank, which again did over 300,000 calls to help Republican House candidates around the country. And
That's awesome.
it is shocking to me how much we were able to do. We would have days on my campaign, which would be, in terms of phone banking, for example, that would churn out the numbers that other campaigns do in a month. So I think that's a testament to how excited people were for my campaign, and which is amazing. And it was important for me after we lost to keep helping other candidates make sure that we harness the red wave, because that I think is one of the only obstacles to Republicans is complacency this midterm cycle. So making sure that people have the info that they need and remember to vote on November 8th.
Yeah, and it's really important to emphasize how building this long-term sustained power of campaigning is critical to winning. That's one of the reasons why I started Startup Caucus, because technology innovation does not follow the campaign cycle. And so we've got to keep going beyond November and building cycle over cycle. Matthew, you mentioned you raised over $200,000 very quickly for your campaign, which is an impressive feat. I think that, in just about any other seat, that would put you at the top of the list of recruits for NRCC. And it's also something that startup founders need to do. So I'm curious to hear what tips you have to share about tapping into your personal network for fundraising, because that can always be a little bit of an uncomfortable conversation.
So it's funny because you're right. I had a tremendous amount of success. We were raising, by the end, we would do, 30,000 a week more on average. I have very little insight on this. I would always say to the team, oh, man, I really hate fundraising. And they said, well, you just raised $35,000. And I think that you just have to explain the case. At the onset, my family, even if I were running in a D plus $1 million, was going to be supportive because they're my family and I'm incredibly appreciative of that. So, what I was told is, you go through the people that and you write how much you think they'll give you, and then you divide it by 2, and then sometimes divide it by 4, and that will be what you actually are realistically going to have when you start out. And I think that the other axiomatic truth is that the first 100,000 raised as a candidate is the hardest, because a lot of times as soon as you start moving away from the people that when you're asking people to donate to you, a lot of times they say, well, how much have you raised so far? And if you say,
Right.
I've raised $10 and that's it, then you'll be laughed out of any room that you go in. So, starting with a good foundation is critical to then expanding beyond, your friends who obviously want you to succeed and will throw you a couple $100.
Give our listeners who are entrepreneurs and building products and businesses in politics a little bit of a glimpse into your decision-making process about how you and your campaign team made those decisions about technology, whether to invest in them, what you were looking for. Give us a little behind the scenes on that mindset.
I think it was fairly straightforward. I don't think that I think the only things that we did that other campaigns don't do is I started off with more name ID than most first-time House candidates. And that way we didn't have to waste time getting me to a point where reporters would understand that this is a serious campaign. But other than that, in terms of just the tools, we used very similar things of email, fundraising, TV ads, the internet. It's just I was more adept at using them than if I were an 80-year-old doing it for the first time.
But what were the sort of
using drones or anything like that?
Right. But what were the, I guess, frameworks or how did you decide we're going to go with this consultant as opposed to that consultant? I'm trying to give our listeners an insight into how they should pitch candidates and campaigns.
Well, that's a great question. I don't even know the answer to that because I had nothing to do with any of those conversations. I said, look, you guys do all of this. I don't think I was on a single call with email fundraisers or anything like that. I just said, you guys, I trust you guys, figure it out. I couldn't care less at all about any of these things because that's really not something any candidate should care about.
Right.
That is, how you descend into micromanaging hell. And, it's not the candidate's job to say, oh, we're going to go with this vendor over that vendor. It really doesn't matter.
Right.
Like from a candidate, like that's not my job. My job is to go out and meet voters and raise money that we can then make sure we can hire vendors and then raise more money because in this district, it's an incredibly expensive media market. And again, Trone, the only thing he does to campaign is drops 10 mil on TV ads to close out a cycle. So it was very important to raise money. We were never going to go dollar for dollar with him, obviously, even if I had won the nomination. But this question, the help I can provide to your listeners is just the knowledge that a candidate should not be on these calls.
Right. So don't pitch the candidate.
Never. If you are, it's not going to matter because they really, I mean, this is my experience from my campaign, which I think is the correct one, is I'm sure you guys are great. I don't care because this is not where my experience is. And, you can make it sound awesome, but again, I just don't, it's not my decision. Really.
Got it.
Talk to my team.
All right. So what was a problem that you experienced campaigning that you think would make for a great tech solution that some startups should go out and get working on?
Better cell service in Western Maryland. It's a huge problem. That's one of the problems in this district. And, when I would be either going to events or door knocking, I have T-Mobile, no service. So, you would do things like download the walkbook app, like the walkbook list ahead of time, and then it would sync up later. But that was one of the biggest problems on the campaign was when I would more or less get past Cumberland, I have no cell service. Other tech things, what are your favorite examples that have been said? Let me brainstorm off of those.
Well, I really use this as just a way to source ideas for new startups to get people.
Honestly, really, whatever Eric's doing is probably a good idea that look at.
But yeah, that's actually a really important practical tip: is do not assume that you have 5G for your application in every context. Right, yeah. Being able to have an offline mode is essential.
Yes.
Well, thanks to Matthew for a great conversation. I'm going to include a link to his Twitter account in the show notes. Give him a follow, stay up to date on what he's doing next. And if this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague, and it also makes you look smart in the process. Remember to subscribe to the Business of Politics show wherever you listen to podcasts, so you never miss an episode. You can also sign up for email updates now at our new website, businessofpoliticspodcast.com. With that, we'll say thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.